There is a kind of arrival that is different from other arrivals. Not the arrival at the end of a short errand, or the arrival home after an ordinary day. This is the other kind, the arrival that you feel in the body before the mind has caught up with it. The arrival that says, you are somewhere that matters. Something about this place is different from other places. This is a peaceful story from the ancient scriptures, set aside for the quiet hours of night. Let it carry you gently toward rest. The people of Israel had been walking for 3 months. 3 months since the night they left Egypt. 3 months of the wilderness of Sinai, its stone and sky, its cold mornings and warm days, its silences that seemed to have no edge. They had crossed the sea. They had camped at Succoth. They had eaten quail and manna and found water in places that should not have had water. They had been learning, one day at a time, what it meant to be a people moving through the wilderness under the guidance of something they could not fully see. And now they arrived at the mountain. It was called Sinai, or Horeb, depending on the tradition. The two names for the same high and ancient place, the place where Moses had first encountered the burning bush, the place that had been called the Mountain of God before anyone could say exactly why. The people came into the wilderness that lay in the shadow of this mountain, and they made their camp there. The mountain rose above them. The sky above the mountain was wide and clear. The wilderness around the camp was quiet. They had arrived somewhere. 3 months of travel from Egypt to here. In the ancient world, this was not a journey that anyone undertook lightly or casually. The Sinai Peninsula was, and remains, a challenging landscape. Arid, hot in summer, cold in winter, largely without the kind of reliable water sources or vegetation that large groups of people need to survive. That the people had made it this far, with their flocks and their children and their elderly and everything they carried, was itself a kind of testimony to the provision that had accompanied them. The mountain was not immediately welcoming. Mountains rarely are in the ancient accounts of encounters with them. This one was high. The Sinai Massif in the southern part of the peninsula includes peaks that rise to nearly 9,000 feet, and even the lower approaches have a quality of altitude and austerity that makes the air feel different, the world feel larger and quieter than it does at sea level. The camp spread out in the plain below the mountain. The tents were set up. The animals were watered and settled. The people, 3 months into a journey whose full length they still did not know, made their temporary home in the shadow of this ancient peak. And then they waited. On the day after they arrived, Moses went up. This is a detail the ancient account records simply and without elaboration. Moses went up to God. The mountain was where God had spoken to him before, at the burning bush. The mountain was, in the geography of this story, a threshold place. A place where the distance between the human and the holy seemed, in some way that is difficult to articulate, smaller. And from the mountain, a word came. It was a word addressed first to Moses, and through Moses to the people. It began by naming what had happened between them, what God had done for the people, and what relationship this established. "You have seen what I did in Egypt," the word said. "You have seen how I carried you, as on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself." Eagle's wings, this image, simple and very old, carries something in it that the more literal descriptions of the journey do not quite capture. An eagle carries its young not in its claws, but under and on its wings, sheltered by the great wingspread, lifted above the dangers below. The image says, you are not left to make this journey on your own strength. You were born, you were carried. The distance between Egypt and this mountain was crossed not by your effort alone, but by something beneath and around you, supporting the journey. Now, therefore, the word continued, if you will listen to my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These words, treasured possession, kingdom of priests, holy nation, were not primarily titles of status or claims to superiority. They were descriptions of a relationship and of a vocation. A treasured possession is something kept close, valued, tended. Priests in the ancient world were people who stood between, who mediated between the community and the holy, who carried the concerns of the people in one direction and the blessing of the holy in another. A holy nation was a nation set apart, not elevated above others, but oriented in a particular direction, given a particular shape of life. The offer was made. Moses came down from the mountain. He gathered the elders of the people and told them what he had heard. The people answered together, everything that God has said, we will do. Moses brought this answer back up the mountain. The response, when it came, included an instruction about time. Go to the people, Moses was told. Tell them to prepare. They will have 3 days. 3 days of consecration, of washing their clothes, of ordering themselves, of turning their attention from the ordinary concerns of camp life towards something that was coming. On the 3rd day, God would descend on the mountain in the sight of all the people. 3 days of preparation. The ancient Near Eastern world understood preparation as a meaningful act, not merely a practical one. To prepare was to signal that what was coming was of a different order than the everyday. The washing of clothes, the outer garments people wore, visible, tangible, was a way of marking the body itself as part of the preparation. The visible garment stands for the person wearing it, and to cleanse it was to participate outwardly in an inward orientation. 3 days was a significant interval in the ancient world's understanding of time, long enough for something to settle, long enough for the ordinary texture of daily life to be interrupted, for the mind to shift from its habitual concerns toward an awareness of what was approaching. The people prepared, they washed, they waited, and they were given a boundary, a limit to be observed around the mountain. They were not to touch the mountain, not to approach its base, until the sound of a long trumpet blast signaled that they could come up. The mountain was to be respected as a place set apart. Something was coming to it that asked for this margin of space. The 3 days passed. There is something restful in its own way about the 3 days of preparation. Not because preparation is effortless. Washing, ordering, attending, waiting, all require something from the people who do them, but because preparation has a completeness to it. When you are preparing, you are not yet at the thing itself. You are in the space before, and that space has its own particular quality. Attentive, oriented, expectant, without urgency. The camp would have been quieter than usual during these 3 days perhaps, not the silence of inattention, but the silence of directed awareness. People going about the necessary tasks of washing and preparation, but doing so with a different quality of presence than the ordinary day-to-day. The mountain was there above them. The sky was there above the mountain. The third day was coming. On the morning of the third day, something happened. The ancient account describes it in terms that have stayed in the world's memory as one of the most vivid passages in the entire scriptural record. But we will let these elements arrive gently, one at a time, as befits a story meant for quiet. There was thunder, there was lightning, a thick cloud covered the mountain, and there was the sound of a very loud trumpet. The people in the camp trembled, not the trembling of terror that collapses a person, but the trembling of the body when it encounters something it does not have a category for, the physical response to magnitude. Moses led the people out of the camp to the foot of the mountain. They stood at the base of it, looking up. The mountain was covered in smoke, the ancient account says, because God had descended on it in fire. The smoke rose from it the way smoke rises from a furnace, thick and continuous, and the mountain shook, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder. Let these details rest in the mind without being pressed. The ancient world knew that certain kinds of natural phenomena, the thunder of storms, the smoke of volcanic activity, the deep rumbling of the earth, the strange sounds that sometimes come from mountains or from the sky, were associated with divine encounter. The ancient Near Eastern world's understanding of the holy was not bloodless or abstract. It was embedded in the physical world, felt in the body, heard in the ear, seen in the sky. The mountain of Sinai, on the third morning, was a place where the holy made itself felt in every sense simultaneously. The people standing at its base were not hearing a philosophical argument or a series of doctrinal claims. They were standing at the edge of something that their bodies registered before their minds could interpret it. And into this, into the smoke and the trembling and the sound, Moses went up. He went up to speak, and then came back down to the people, and went up again, and came back down. This movement between the people and the mountain, between the human community and the holy presence above, was the movement of his particular calling. He was the one who went between. And then God spoke, not to Moses alone on this occasion, to the people. The ancient account is careful about this. The words that were spoken were addressed to all of Israel, to the whole assembly standing at the foot of the mountain. Moses was present, but he was not the audience. The people were the audience. And what was spoken has become, across 3,000 years of telling, one of the most recognized passages in the history of human moral thought. Not primarily because it is philosophically sophisticated, though it is. Not primarily because it covers a comprehensive range of human behavior, though it does, but because it arrives as something personal, addressed in the second person, speaking to you, speaking to each one. It began with an identification. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Before any instruction, before any command, before any expectation, an identification. This is who is speaking. This is the relationship being invoked. The one who speaks is the same one who carried you on eagle's wings. The one who is now giving guidance is the same one who has already demonstrated faithfulness. The guidance that follows is given within this frame, not given by a distant authority issuing decrees from outside the relationship, given by the one who already knows these people, has already acted on their behalf, has already demonstrated a care for their welfare. The commandments come from within a covenant, not as the precondition for one. The first of the words concerned orientation. You shall have no other gods before me. In the ancient world, this was not an abstract philosophical statement. The world of the ancient Near East was populated, in the understanding of its inhabitants, by many divine beings, the gods of Egypt, the gods of Canaan, the gods of the nations to the east and west. These were understood as real forces, associated with specific aspects of the natural world or specific human concerns. The sun, the storm, the fertility of the ground, the sea, the underworld. Each had its divine patron or patrons in the cosmology of the ancient world. The people of Israel were being called to a different orientation, not to deny the existence of other divine forces, but to orient themselves toward one God alone, the God who had brought them out of Egypt, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God of the burning bush. This God, and no other, was to be the center of their life as a people. This is the foundational word from which the others flow. The orientation of a life, what it is centered on, what it returns to, what it organizes itself around, this determines everything else. The first word sets the direction. The second word followed closely from the first. No carved images, no shaped representations of divine things, no figure in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. The holy was not to be captured in form, not to be contained in an object, not to be approached through the mediation of something made by human hands. This too had a particular resonance in the ancient world. Egypt was a land of images. The great temples were full of divine representations, and the gods were depicted in animal forms and human forms and combinations of the two. The people had grown up in this visual world of divine imagery. They were being asked to leave that world behind, as they had left Egypt behind, not only physically, but imaginatively. The God they were called to was not one who could be contained in stone or wood or gold. The God they were called to was not, in some deep and essential sense, representable. To make an image of the holy was not simply a mistake in religious technique. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of what the holy is. The third word concerned the name. The name of God was not to be taken up lightly, used emptily, spoken in ways that drained it of its weight. The name carried the reality of the one it named, and to use a name carelessly was to treat the one named carelessly. In the ancient world, names were not merely labels. They were held to contain something of the essence of the thing they named. To know a name was to have some relationship with the reality behind it. The name of God was therefore to be held with care, not avoided, not hidden, not treated as too sacred for ordinary use, but spoken with the awareness of what it invoked. Spoken, when spoken, with the quality of attention that the one name deserved. This is a word about how the sacred is held in ordinary speech, in the daily use of language, in the thousand small ways that names and words either honor or diminish what they point to. The fourth word concerned time. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. The people had already encountered the Sabbath in the rhythm of the manna, the 6 days of gathering and the seventh day of rest, the double portion on the sixth day, the provision that kept. Now the Sabbath was spoken as a commandment, given its formal place in the structure of life. And with the commandment came a reason. In 6 days, the ancient word said, God made heaven and earth and sea and everything in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. The Sabbath rests on the deepest foundation the ancient text knows, the structure of creation itself. The rhythm of 6 and 1 was not invented for the people of Israel as a practical management of labor. It was woven into the fabric of the world at its making. The day of rest was part of how the world was made. To keep the Sabbath was, in this sense, to align oneself with the rhythm of creation, to stop once every 7 days because the creator of the world stopped, to rest because the one who made rest also rested. The fifth word turned from the relationship between human beings and the holy to the relationships between human beings themselves. It stood at the hinge between the two. Honor your father and your mother. This word carries a weight that is easy to underestimate from a distance. In the ancient world, the family was the foundational unit of society, not merely sentimentally, but structurally, legally, economically. The family was the basic form of human organization, the primary locus of identity and responsibility and care. To honor the parents was to honor the structure itself, the long chain of generation through which life was transmitted, through which the stories were told, through which the understanding of God and covenant and identity was passed from one generation to the next. Parents in the ancient Israelite household were also the primary teachers. The ancient texts are full of instructions to parents to tell the stories to their children, to answer when the children ask, to recite the history, to pass on the understanding. The relationship between parent and child was the vehicle through which the entire covenantal inheritance was carried. To honor father and mother was, in this larger context, to honor the whole transmission of which they were a part. It was to respect the source of one's own life and formation, to acknowledge the debt that every generation owes to the one before it. The word came with a promise attached, that those who honored their parents would live long in the land given to them. The keeping of the commandment was tied, in this quiet way, to the continuity and health of the community. The words that followed were shorter in their original form, their brevity itself a kind of authority. 6 words that covered the essential shape of life together in community. You shall not murder. Human life made in the image of God. This is the foundation on which the word stands. The ancient tradition understood human beings as uniquely bearing the image of the divine, and violence against a person was therefore an assault on something that partook of the sacred. The prohibition was not only a practical regulation for social order, it was a recognition of the dignity of every human life. You shall not commit adultery. Marriage in the ancient world was not only a personal relationship between two people, though it was that, it was also a social institution. a structure of commitment and faithfulness that had implications for the whole community, for the security of children, for the stability of households, for the integrity of the social fabric. Faithfulness within marriage was faithfulness to a larger structure of which the marriage was a part. You shall not steal. What belongs to another person, their goods, their property, their harvest, their livestock, is not available to be taken by those who did not earn or receive it. This seems simple, but in a community of thousands of people traveling through wilderness, camped in close proximity, sharing scarce resources, the question of what belongs to whom and why it matters would have been very practical and very present. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. In the ancient world, as in every world, the testimony of witnesses in legal and communal disputes had enormous power. A false accusation could destroy a person's life, their reputation, their property, their freedom, their relationships. The word against bearing false witness was not simply about politeness or social harmony. It was about justice, the protection of the vulnerable from the power of those who might use false words against them. You shall not covet. This final word, or pair of words, since it covered both the neighbor's house and the neighbor's family and possessions, reached inward in a way the previous words had not. The others had concerned actions, the doing or not doing of things in the visible external world. This one concerned the interior, the longing, the reaching desire toward what belongs to someone else. Coveting is the seed from which many of the other transgressions grow. Coveting the neighbor's house leads to stealing. Coveting the neighbor's spouse leads to adultery. Coveting what belongs to another leads to bearing false witness in disputes. The word against coveting addressed not the fruit of the tree, but the root. It was the final word, and perhaps the most searching one, the one that went deepest into the inner life. When the people heard, when the thunder and the sound of the trumpet and the smoke and the mountains trembling had all been part of their experience, when the words had been spoken into this atmosphere, the people stood back. The ancient account records that they were afraid, not the fear that flees, but the fear that stills. They stood at a distance, and they said to Moses, "You speak to us. Let God not speak to us directly, or we will die." This is a very human response to magnitude, the recognition that there is something too large to be faced directly without a mediator, the instinctive reaching for an intermediary, someone to stand between the fullness of the holy and the limited capacity of the human person to receive it. Moses answered them gently. "Do not be afraid," he said. "God has come to test you, to let the fear of God be before you, so that you will not sin. The encounter with the holy is not primarily an encounter with danger, but with reality. The trembling is the body's response to something real, something of greater weight and substance than the ordinary." Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was, and the people stood at a distance. There is something very quiet in this image. The mountain with its smoke and cloud, the people gathered at its foot, at a respectful distance. Moses, their mediator, moving between them and the presence on the mountain, going back and forth, carrying words in both directions, translating the divine into the human and the human into the divine. This is his calling, received at the burning bush, and exercised now before the whole community. He is the one who goes between, the one who can approach and return and tell what has been heard. The people stood at a distance, and yet they heard. The words had been spoken to them, addressed to you in the second person, to the assembly of Israel at the foot of the mountain. Whatever the distance, the words had reached them. They had been in the presence of what was spoken, even if they had stepped back from the mountain itself. The words had been given. The words were complete. The 10 words, the ancient tradition calls them the 10 words, the Decalogue, the 10 utterances. Not 10 laws in the way that legal codes are laws, with their conditions and penalties and procedures. 10 words, 10 utterances, a form of language that is close to address, close to the intimacy of speech between persons who know each other. I am the Lord your God. You shall not. The first person, the second person, the speaker and the addressed, a direct relationship expressed in direct language with the simplicity that belongs to things that are fundamental. The mountain was still. The thunder had subsided, or perhaps had never been thunder in the ordinary sense. The ancient account uses the word that means something like voices, or sounds, or thunderings, and whether the phenomenon was meteorological or something else entirely, it had passed into a deep quiet. The people were still at the foot of the mountain. Moses was on the mountain. The sky above was the wide Sinai sky, which keeps its own counsel and does not change with the moods of the people below it. The wilderness around the camp was unchanged, stone and dust, and the sparse vegetation of a high-altitude desert, unchanged by what had just occurred at the mountain's foot, unchanged by the words that had been spoken, indifferent in the way that landscape is indifferent. And yet everything had changed. The ancient word for the relationship between God and Israel was covenant, berith in Hebrew, a word that implies a formal, binding, mutual agreement between parties. A covenant was not merely a promise, though it included promises. It was not merely a contract, though it included commitments. It was something closer to a relationship given a formal shape, a structure of mutual belonging, of stated obligations, of known terms. Covenants in the ancient world were established between nations, between rulers and their people, between families. They had standard forms, a history of the relationship between the parties, a statement of who was making the covenant and why, a list of the terms and the stipulations that the relationship required. The structure of Exodus 19 and 20 follows something of this shape. The identification of the one giving the covenant. I am the Lord your God. The history of the relationship. Who brought you out of Egypt. The terms, the 10 words. A covenant was being established, formally and publicly, at the foot of the mountain. The people had already said, everything that God has said, we will do. This was their acceptance. The covenant was sealed in words before it was sealed later in ceremony and blood and the elaborate rituals that would follow in the chapters ahead. The covenant at Sinai was the foundational relationship of the community. It was what defined them as a people, not merely their shared history, or their shared ancestry, or their shared experience of slavery and exodus, but their shared commitment to this particular relationship with this particular God, expressed in this particular way of life. A covenant is not simply a set of rules. rules exist to constrain behavior from outside, to prevent people from doing what they might otherwise do. A covenant shapes life from within. It tells the parties who they are to each other and what that relationship asks of them. The 10 words were not, in this sense, primarily restrictions. They were a description of the shape of a life lived in covenant with the holy and with one another. A life that honors the source of its existence, that marks time with rest, that holds the lives of others as sacred, that speaks truly, that refrains from reaching for what does not belong to it. This is the shape of a human life oriented toward the holy, not a burden placed on the people from outside, but a form of life given to people who had already been given freedom. The form that freedom takes when it is ordered towards something good. The 10 words, in their original form, are remarkably brief. This briefness is one of their qualities, and worth noticing. They do not explain themselves at great length. They do not anticipate every situation to which they might apply. They do not legislate the details of how they are to be followed in every possible circumstance. They are, instead, principles, or perhaps better, orientations. They point in directions. They establish the basic shape of a life without specifying every detail of its furniture. The Israelite legal tradition that developed from them, in the chapters and books that follow in the ancient text, is elaborate and detailed and covers an enormous range of situations, from agricultural practices to judicial procedures to dietary regulations to the treatment of workers and foreigners and the poor. All of that developed from these 10 words, as a tree grows from a seed. But the seed is simple. The 10 words are the seed. Honor God. Respect what is holy. Rest. Honor your parents. Do not kill. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. Do not covet. In these simple orientations, the whole shape of a community's life is contained. There is a quality of rest in simplicity when the simplicity is genuine, not the false simplicity that ignores complexity, not the oversimplification that pretends the world is easier than it is, but the genuine simplicity of a few deep things, clearly stated, that turn out to contain everything they need to contain. The 10 words have this quality. They are simple enough to be memorized by a child. They are deep enough that generations of scholars and ordinary people have spent lifetimes understanding what they mean and how they apply. The depth does not contradict the simplicity. It inhabits it. A person who truly honors their parents, who truly does not covet, who truly does not bear false witness. Such a person is not someone who has simply followed a list. They are someone whose inner life has been shaped in a particular direction. The outward conduct flows from an inward formation. The words were spoken to shape a people, not merely their behavior, but themselves. After the people had stepped back and Moses had reassured them, Moses went up into the thick darkness. The ancient account uses this phrase, thick darkness, to describe where God was. This is a paradox that the ancient writers did not try to resolve. The cloud and the darkness on the mountain was also the place of divine presence. The obscurity and the presence coincided. In the ancient world, darkness was not simply the absence of light. It was a substance in the imagination, a thing that had its own quality, its own weight. The darkness of the mountain was not empty. It was full of something that the light of ordinary day could not contain or display. Moses went into it, into the thick darkness, and there, in that obscured and weighty place, the giving of the covenant continued. More words, more instructions, the elaborate detail of what the life of this people would look like as it unfolded. The 10 words were the beginning, the foundation, the seed. What came in the darkness on the mountain, in the long conversation between Moses and God that would fill many more chapters of the ancient text, was the development of everything that grew from that foundation. But this belongs to other tellings, other evenings. For now, let the mountain be what it is in this moment, smoky, trembling, veiled in cloud, with Moses inside the cloud and the people at its foot, and the 10 words still sounding in the air. These 10 words have traveled a very long distance. From the foot of Mount Sinai, in a desert peninsula between Africa and Asia, more than 3,000 years ago, through the long story of the Israelite people, through their time in the wilderness and their entry into the promised land and their years of settlement and their centuries of kingdom and their long periods of exile and return and rebuilding, through the development of Jewish law and practice, which interpreted and applied and elaborated on these words across 2,000 years of scholarship and community life. And then, through the texts of the Christian communities that emerged from the same root, the words traveled further, into Europe, into every language of Europe, into the legal traditions and the moral thinking and the communal life of nations that may never have read the original Hebrew, but whose structures of law and community were shaped by people who had. The 10 words have become part of the moral vocabulary of much of the world, not because they are imposed on everyone, they are not, but because they have been carried by people who shaped institutions and communities and ways of thinking that in turn shaped others. A seed planted at the foot of a desert mountain 3 millennia ago grew into something that reached around the world, not perfectly, not without distortion or misuse or the 1,000 ways that good things are complicated by human imperfection, but persistently. The words have traveled far. The words themselves are simple enough that they can be held in the mind quietly at the end of a long day without effort or strain, not as items to be checked against behavior, not as a test to pass or fail, simply as words, as the 10 orientations of a life that is ordered toward the holy and toward the good, toward God in the first 4, toward one another in the final 6, with the 5th bridging the 2. This is the shape, this is the direction, this is what was spoken at the mountain, into the thunder and the smoke and the sound of the trumpet, to the people who were trembling at the foot of the mountain, and through them, across all the generations, to everyone who has ever heard the story told. Let the mind come back now to the camp at the foot of the mountain. The long day is ending. The sun, which was at its height, when the events of the morning were at their height, has traveled across the sky and is now declining toward the western horizon. The quality of light is changing, softer now, the shadows longer, the rock faces of the mountain catching the warm amber of the afternoon sun. The people have returned to their tents. The animals have been tended. The fires are being lit for the evening meal. The children who were held close during the morning's events, children who felt the trembling of the ground and heard the sounds from the mountain and saw the faces of their parents, wide-eyed with something the children had no name for. These children are now going about the small and ordinary business of evening. The mountain is still above them. The cloud that covered it is still there, or has shifted, or has thinned as the day has progressed. The ancient account is not specific about the precise moment-to-moment meteorology, but the mountain is still there, and what happened on it today has not ceased to be real simply because the evening has come. The people of Israel, camped at the foot of Sinai, would remain in this place for a significant time. The ancient account suggests almost a year, months during which the covenant was sealed in ceremony, during which the structure of the community's worship and governance was established, during which the tabernacle was built, the elaborate portable shrine that would accompany them through the rest of their wilderness years. But all of that is ahead. Tonight, they are simply at the mountain, in the evening of the day when the 10 words were given. The fire is warm. The manna has been gathered and prepared. The families are together. The 10 words are new, fresh in the ears of those who heard them, still finding their place in the understanding of people who had just experienced something that shook the ground beneath them. The words had not yet become familiar. They had not yet become the established center of a way of life, the reference point for centuries of legal interpretation, the foundation of a tradition. They were simply new, given today, still carrying the weight of the morning that had given them. Mountains occupy a particular place in the ancient imagination that is not simply geographical. They are high, and height in the ancient world was associated with proximity to the divine. The gods of many ancient Near Eastern traditions lived on mountains, or were encountered on them, or descended to them when they wished to communicate with the world below. The temple in Jerusalem, when it was built on a hill, and the architectural tradition of the tabernacle that preceded it, and the cosmic mountain imagery that underlies both, reflects this deep association between height and holiness. The Sinai Massif in the southern Sinai Peninsula includes some of the most dramatic mountain scenery in the ancient world. The peaks rise steeply from the desert floor, their faces sheer and imposing, their colors shifting through the day from brown to red to purple. In the early morning, before the sun has fully risen, the mountains hold a quality of stillness and shadow that makes them seem older than ordinary geology, as though they have been waiting patiently for something that they themselves have not fully disclosed. Moses had encountered God at this mountain before, at the burning bush that was not consumed. That encounter had sent him to Egypt. Now he was back at the same mountain, with the people he had led out of Egypt, and the mountain was doing something different from what it had done at the burning bush. It was not burning quietly with one man watching. It was trembling and smoking with a whole people standing at its foot. The mountain had been a private place of encounter, and then it became a public one. This movement from the private encounter to the public one, from the individual calling to the communal covenant, is one of the quiet patterns of this story. Moses alone at the bush, then Moses before Pharaoh, then Moses leading the people. then the whole people at the foot of the mountain. The story keeps expanding its circle of inclusion. Each stage of the story draws more people into what had begun in a private place with a single man who did not think he was the right person for any of it. By the time the 10 words are spoken, the circle is as wide as it will be. The whole assembled people, with all their children and elderly and mixed multitude of fellow travelers, all standing at the foot of the mountain, all hearing the words addressed to them in the second person, you, all of them together, and each one individually. The words that were spoken to the whole community were also spoken to each person within it. The covenant was communal, and it was personal, both at once. After the thunder and the mountain and the words, there is a stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, not the silence that follows the end of something, but the stillness that is full, that carries within it everything that has just occurred. The way a room is different after an important conversation, even when the conversation is over and everyone has left. The air holds something. The space is changed. The wilderness around the mountain held this quality of fullness in the evening after the giving of the words. The people who had been at the foot of the mountain, who had trembled and stepped back and asked Moses to be their intermediary, were carrying within them the weight of what they had experienced, not a weight that crushed. The fear Moses had named was not the fear that destroys, but the fear that orients, not the weight of burden, but the weight of significance. Something important had happened to them today. They would live with this knowledge, carry it in their bodies and their memories, tell it to their children and their children's children. The day they stood at the foot of the mountain and heard the voice from the smoke. This is the kind of memory that does not fade easily, the kind that returns unprompted in quiet moments. The smell of smoke, or the sound of distant thunder, or the particular quality of a mountain against a wide sky, and brings with it the whole feeling of the original experience. Let the evening at the mountain settle around the imagination now. The camp in the late light, the mountain above, its peak still catching the last of the day's sun, while the lower slopes are already in shadow. The fires small and warm, the children beginning to settle, the older people sitting at the entrances to their tents, looking up at the mountain in the quiet way of people who have nothing more to do today. The 10 words are in the air, not literally. The voice from the mountain is still, but in the way that important words continue to resonate after they have been spoken, the words are present. They will be present tomorrow and the day after, and in all the days of the people's journey through the wilderness and into the land beyond. They have been given. They cannot be ungiven. They are the shape of a life, the basic orientation, the fundamental directions, the 10 words that contain a whole way of being in the world. The covenant made at Sinai became, in the long memory of Israel, the defining event of the people's identity. Not the creation, not the calling of Abraham, not the Exodus itself, as central as it was. The covenant at Sinai, the 10 words given at the mountain, the whole formal establishment of the relationship between God and this people, became the reference point for everything else. The prophets who came centuries later returned to it again and again. When they called the people back to faithfulness, they called them back to Sinai. When they described the failure of the community, they described it in terms of the covenant that had been made at the mountain. The covenant was not simply a historical event to be commemorated. It was a living relationship to be maintained, or, in times of failure, to be returned to. It could be neglected. The ancient texts acknowledge plainly. It could be broken, or at least badly bent, but it could also be renewed, returned to, re-entered, reaffirmed. The possibility of return was always present. This quality of the covenant, its renewability, its capacity to absorb failure and begin again, is one of its quieter features. The 10 words were not given as a test that, once failed, ended the relationship. They were given as the shape of a life to which the people could always, at any point, reorient themselves. The memory of Sinai traveled with the people in a particular form. The ancient account describes 2 tablets of stone on which the 10 words were written. These tablets would be kept in the covenant chest, the ark, that was built to house them, and that traveled with the people through all their wilderness years, and eventually came to rest in the temple in Jerusalem. 2 tablets. The ancient tradition has wondered about the significance of the 2. Perhaps the words concerning relationship with God on one tablet, and the words concerning relationship with one another on the other. Perhaps 2 copies of the covenant, as was customary in the ancient Near East when covenants were made between parties. The ancient text does not explain. It simply says, 2 tablets, the writing of God, engraved on stone. Stone is one of the most permanent of materials. Words engraved in stone do not fade, do not wash away, do not wear out with use the way words spoken into air eventually do. The choice of stone for the tablets carries something. The sense that what was written was not provisional or temporary or subject to revision. It was set, the way stone is set, in the material that says, "This endures." Let the story settle now, as the wilderness settles at the end of a day. The mountain is still. The cloud on its peak is moving gently, or is still, or has thinned with the cooling of the night air. The stars above the Sinai Peninsula are extraordinary. This far from any settled place, away from any source of artificial light, the stars are exactly what they were 3,000 years ago, when the people of Israel camped at the foot of this mountain. The same stars, the same constellations, the same great sweep of light across the dark. The camp is quiet. The fires are low. The 10 words have been given and heard and are beginning the long process of settling into the life of a people who will carry them across all the centuries. Moses is somewhere on the mountain, or has come down and is among the people, or is preparing to go up again in the morning to receive the rest of what will be given. The ancient account moves quickly through these days, covering in a few verses what must have been weeks or months. But tonight, there is simply this: the mountain, the camp, the quiet, the 10 words. Not a burden, not a cage, a shape, a form given to freedom, the way a riverbank gives form to water without preventing the water from being what it is. The commandments are the banks of a river, and the life that flows within them is still fully, genuinely life. Let the 10 words rest in the mind tonight without being pressed or analyzed. Let them be what they are: simple, deep, old, and addressed to the people who heard them at the mountain, and to everyone who has heard them since. Toward the holy, with reverence and rest, toward one another, with honor and truth. This is the shape, this is the direction, and it is a gentle shape when we let it be gentle. The commandment against murder does not demand constant vigilance. It is simply the recognition that life is sacred. The commandment against coveting is not an injunction to suppress all desire. It is the turning of desire toward what is already given, rather than toward what belongs to another. The 10 words, held gently, are not a weight. They are a form of rest, a framework within which life can be oriented without constant effort of self-determination, a structure that says, here is the direction. You do not have to figure it out from nothing. Here it is, given at the mountain, written in stone, carried in the chest through the wilderness and into the land. Let the breath slow now. Let the body rest where it lies. Let the weight of this day, whatever it held, settle downward into the ground that holds you. The mountain was given its cloud and its fire and its voice for one day, and the day has passed, and the mountain is simply a mountain again in the evening. Old stone, old sky, the stars doing what they always do, moving in their slow and ancient courses above the place where the people are sleeping. The 10 words are given. They do not need to be given again tonight. They rest in the stone, in the chest, in the long memory of the people who have carried them. They rest in the quiet of this moment, in whatever way old and true things rest in the minds of those who have heard them and are now lying down to sleep. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out. This is the beginning of everything, the identification, the relationship, the one who speaks and who has already acted, and who gave the words as a gift to people who had already been given freedom. Rest in this beginning. You are known. The words were spoken to you, to all who stand in the tradition of those who heard them, and they have not stopped being given. Be still. The mountain is quiet. The stars are turning. The camp is sleeping. And the words carved in stone rest in their place. Rest. Sleep. Amen.